The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 15th, 1944. Private James McKenna pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he peered through the frost-covered window. Of the farmhouse that served as his unit's temporary headquarters, the 28th Infantry Division had been enjoying what their commanding officers called a quiet sector, a stretch of the Western Front, where the most dangerous enemy seemed to be the biting cold rather than German bullets. McKenna had no way of knowing that less than 20 miles away, in the dense woods of the Eifel region, over 200,000 German soldiers were making final preparations for what would become Adolf Hitler's last great gamble on the Western Front. The Führer had christened it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. But history would remember it by a different name: the Battle of the Bulge. The deception had been masterful. For weeks, German forces had moved only at night, their vehicles muffled and their radio communications kept to an absolute minimum. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, despite his reservations about the operation's ambitious objectives, had overseen the concentration of 3 entire armies along an 85-mile front that the Allies considered one of the quietest sectors of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harwick of the 106th Infantry Division stood in his command post in the village of St. Vith, studying intelligence reports that painted a picture of German forces in retreat. According to this context, taken from Allied intelligence summaries documented in Charles MacDonald's A Time for Trumpets, the Wehrmacht appeared to be conserving its strength for defensive operations along the Siegfried Line. The report spoke of demoralized German units, shortages of fuel and ammunition, an enemy army on the verge of collapse. How wrong they were! In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, Oberst Friedrich von der Heydt gathered his paratroopers of the 6th Parachute Regiment for their final briefing. Their mission was audacious: drop behind enemy lines near the town of Malmedy and disrupt Allied communications and supply lines. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation had become Germany's most reliable strategy as the Third Reich faced annihilation on multiple fronts. The plan that Hitler had conceived in the Wolf's Lair was breathtaking in its scope. 3 German armies would punch through the thinly defended Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to capture the vital port of Antwerp. In doing so, they would split the British 21st Army Group from the American forces, potentially forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the East. General Omar Bradley had dismissed the Ardennes as unsuitable for major offensive operations, calling the dense forests and steep ravines a calculated risk that the Germans would never attempt to exploit. The terrain that had channeled German panzers to stunning victory in 1940 was now considered impassable for modern mechanized warfare. This miscalculation would prove nearly catastrophic, as McKenna settled down for what he assumed would be another quiet night of guard duty. The sound of distant artillery began to rumble through the forest like approaching thunder. At first, he dismissed it as routine harassment fire, the kind of sporadic shelling that had become as common as the morning frost. But the rumbling grew louder, more persistent, and soon the entire horizon seemed to flicker with the orange glow of muzzle flashes. The coldest battle of World War II was about to begin. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the earth itself seemed to explode along the Ardennes front. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously in what would become one of the most concentrated bombardments of the entire Western campaign. The barrage fell like a steel avalanche across American positions that had grown comfortable in their supposed security. Private McKenna's farmhouse shuddered as the first shells began falling nearby. Windows shattered, sending glass cascading across maps and radio equipment. Outside, the peaceful winter landscape transformed into a hellscape of fire and twisted metal as German artillery systematically worked over every known American position in the command bunker of the 99th Infantry Division. Major General Walter Lauer grabbed his field telephone as reports began flooding in from his forward positions. The calls came in fragments, panicked voices reporting massive artillery barrages, followed by the ominous crackling of static as communication lines were severed by the bombardment. Within minutes, Entire sectors of the front had gone silent. The German 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS Oberstgruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, led the northern prong of the assault. Dietrich's panzers had been given the most direct route to Antwerp, driving through the Lausium Gap and the twin villages of Verschereth crinkled. His forces included the elite 1st and 12th SS Panzer divisions, battle-hardened veterans, who had fought on the Eastern Front and knew that failure meant the end of the Third Reich to the south. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army targeted the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction that controlled 7 major highways converging like spokes on a wheel. Manteufel, unlike the brutal Dietrich, was a skilled tactician who understood that speed and surprise would be more valuable than brute force in the opening hours of the offensive. The southernmost attack came from General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army, tasked with protecting the assault's southern flank as the panzers drove toward the Meuse River, though equipped primarily with infantry divisions rather than armor. Brandenberger's men carried the crucial responsibility of preventing American reinforcements from striking the main offensive from the south. As dawn broke gray and cold over the battlefield, American defenders found themselves facing an enemy they had been told was beaten and demoralized. Instead, the Germans who emerged from the forest mist were well-equipped, well-supplied, and fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew this was their last chance to change the course of the war. Captain John Mitchell of the 14th Cavalry Group found himself in the path of Kampfrupp Piper, an armored spearhead led by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper. The 29-year-old Piper was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had earned both military decorations and a reputation for ruthlessness that would soon manifest itself in the snowy fields of Belgium. Mitchell's lightly armored reconnaissance vehicles were no match for Piper's King Tiger tanks and assault guns. As German armor rolled over his positions near Lanzarote, Mitchell managed to radio a desperate warning before his unit was overrun. They're coming in force, hundreds of tanks and thousands of infantry. This isn't a raid, this is a full-scale offensive. According to this context taken from Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history, the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, the initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise across nearly the entire front. American units that had been expecting a quiet Christmas found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy that wasn't supposed to exist in such numbers. In Luxembourg City, General Omar Bradley was hosting a dinner party when the first reports of the German offensive reached his headquarters. Like most Allied commanders, Bradley initially dismissed the attacks as limited spoiling operations designed to disrupt Allied preparations for their own spring offensive. It would take hours before the true scope of Hitler's gamble became apparent. The snow continued to fall, grounding Allied aircraft and providing perfect cover for German armor as it pushed deeper into American-held territory. Road signs were turned around. English-speaking German commandos in American uniforms began spreading confusion behind the lines, and panic started to ripple through units that had grown accustomed to thinking of themselves as the hunters, rather than the hunted by nightfall on December 16th. The German offensive had torn a bulge nearly 50 miles wide in the Allied lines. American units were retreating, regrouping, or fighting desperate delaying actions as 3 German armies poured through gaps that weren't supposed to exist. The coldest battle had begun in earnest. The morning of December 17, 1944 brought no relief from the German onslaught. If anything, the second day of the offensive proved even more devastating, as German armored spearheads exploited the gaps torn in American lines and drove deeper into Belgium. The roads, slick with ice and churned by tank treads, became highways of retreat for American forces. Caught off guard by the ferocity of Hitler's winter gamble, Kampfrupp Piper had advanced nearly 20 miles from their starting positions, leaving a trail of burning American vehicles and abandoned equipment in their wake. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper's column consisted of over 4,000 men and more than 600 vehicles, including massive King Tiger tanks that could obliterate American Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 2 miles. But it was not Piper's armor that would make December 17th infamous. It was what happened at a crossroads near the Belgian town of Malad. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Elements of Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were retreating south toward St. Vith when they encountered the lead elements of Piper's armored column near Ardennes Crossroads. The American convoy, consisting of 30 vehicles and 140 men, was completely outgunned and surrounded within minutes. Lieutenant Virgil Larry, commanding the lead section of the American convoy, had no choice but to surrender. When German tanks appeared on the road ahead and behind his vehicles, the Americans were ordered out of their trucks and jeeps with their hands raised, believing they would be processed as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention. They were wrong. The German soldiers herded the captured Americans into a snow-covered field adjacent to the crossroads. For several minutes, the prisoners stood in the bitter cold, while German officers appeared to debate what to do with them. Some of the Americans later recalled hearing heated arguments in German between SS officers and Wehrmacht personnel attached to the KMPF GRUPPE. Then, without warning, an SS officer drew his pistol and fired 2 shots into the group of prisoners. This was the signal for massacre. German machine guns positioned around the field opened fire on the defenseless Americans, cutting them down in the snow. Those who fell wounded were finished off with pistol shots to the head as German soldiers moved among the bodies. Private Homer Ford played dead in the bloody snow as German soldiers stepped over and around the bodies of his comrades. He later testified that he could hear the moans and cries of wounded men being systematically executed by the SS troops. The massacre continued for nearly 20 minutes before the German column moved on, leaving 84 American soldiers dead in the field. Incredibly, a handful of Americans survived the slaughter. Private Ford and several others waited until the German column had passed before crawling into the nearby woods. Wounded and frostbitten, these survivors made their way back to American lines, where their reports of the massacre spread like wildfire through the American forces. According to this context taken from War Crimes Investigation records compiled by the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Office, the Malmedy massacre became a rallying cry for American forces fighting in the Ardennes. The news that German forces were executing prisoners of war stripped away any illusions about the nature of the enemy they faced and stiffened American resolve to fight to the death rather than surrender. Word of the massacre reached General Omar Bradley's headquarters within hours. Bradley immediately ordered that all American units be informed of what had happened at Ardennes Crossroads. The effect was electric. American soldiers who had been retreating in some disorder suddenly found new reserves of courage and determination. They would give no quarter to an enemy who showed none. Meanwhile, Kampfrupp Piper continued its drive toward the Meuse River, but the massacre at Malmedy had cost precious time. Piper's tight schedule called for reaching the river within 48 hours of the offensive's launch, but his column was already behind schedule. The delay would prove significant as American reinforcements raced toward the battlefield. The weather remained. Piper's ally, thick clouds, grounded Allied aircraft and prevented reconnaissance flights that might have revealed the true scope of the German offensive, but radio intercepts were beginning to paint a clearer picture for Allied intelligence officers. This wasn't a spoiling attack or a local counteroffensive. This was Hitler's attempt to repeat his stunning success of 1940. As night fell, on December 17th, American units throughout the Ardennes found themselves fighting desperate, holding actions against superior German forces. Some units broke and fled. Others fought to the last man. But in every case, the news of Malmedy had the same effect. There would be no easy surrender. No assumption that the Germans would honor the laws of war. This was a fight to the finish, and the Americans finally understood what they were truly facing. In the frozen forests of Belgium, the Bulge and Allied lines continued to grow, but so did American determination to contain it. By December 19th, 1944, the German offensive had created a salient nearly 60 miles wide and 30 miles deep in the Allied lines. American forces were retreating on multiple fronts, and panic was beginning to spread through rear area units as reports of German breakthrough units reached towns that had been considered safely behind the lines. But at one critical road junction, a stand was being prepared that would define the entire battle. Bastogne was not much to look at, a modest Belgian town of 4,000 inhabitants. Surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, but its location made it the most strategically important piece of real estate in the Ardennes. 7 major roads converged on the town like spokes on a wheel, making it impossible for German armor to bypass on their drive to the Meuse River. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of men and supplies throughout the southern Ardennes. General Hasso von Manteuffel understood this perfectly. His 5th Panzer Army had been given the mission of capturing Bastogne intact, then using it as a springboard for the drive to Antwerp. But when his lead elements reached the outskirts of the town on December 20th, they found it defended by the most unlikely of opponents. The 101st Airborne Division had been resting and refitting in the French town of Reims. When the German offensive began, these were the same paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought their way across France through the summer and fall of 1944. They were supposed to be enjoying a well-deserved rest, but instead found themselves loaded onto trucks and rushed toward Belgium with whatever equipment they could carry. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's acting commander, arrived in Bastogne on December 19th to find chaos. Retreating American units were streaming through the town, carrying tales of German atrocities and overwhelming enemy strength. McAuliffe had approximately 12,000 men under his command, paratroopers, glider infantry, and attached armor and artillery units. Against them, Manteuffel was preparing to unleash 2 entire panzer corps. The first German probe came on December 20th, when elements of the 2nd Panzer Division attempted to seize the town in a coup de main. They were met by the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, which had established defensive positions in the hills surrounding Bastogne. The paratroopers, armed with bazookas and determination, knocked out several German tanks and forced the attackers to withdraw. Manteuffel quickly realized that Bastogne would not fall to a hasty assault. He ordered the town surrounded and began positioning his artillery for a systematic bombardment. By December 21st, the encirclement was complete. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped, along with elements of several other American units that had been caught in Bastogne when the German noose tightened. The siege began in earnest on December 22nd. German artillery hammered the town while infantry probes tested the American perimeter. Medical supplies ran low, ammunition was rationed, and food became scarce. The defenders were forced to scavenge equipment from destroyed German vehicles and supplement their rations with whatever they could find in abandoned Belgian homes. According to this context taken from SLA Marshall's official battle narrative, Bastogne. The story of the first 8 days, the psychological pressure on the surrounded Americans was immense. Radio intercepts revealed German units discussing the execution of prisoners, and the memory of Mamadi haunted every man in the garrison. Surrender was not an option, it was a death sentence. The weather remained brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow continuing to fall intermittently. Wounded men froze to death in aid stations that lacked adequate heating, and frostbite became as dangerous an enemy as German bullets. The paratroopers wrapped themselves in blankets and tablecloths, scavenged from Belgian homes, creating an army that looked more like refugees than elite soldiers. On December 22nd, German envoys approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, demanding the immediate surrender of Bastogne. The ultimatum warned that failure to surrender would result in the complete destruction of the garrison and gave the Americans 2 hours to consider their response. McAuliffe's reply became legendary. When presented with the German ultimatum, the general's immediate response was a single word: nuts. His staff convinced him that the German envoys might not understand American slang, so the official written response read, to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. The German envoys were reportedly puzzled by the response and asked for clarification. Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered McAuliffe's reply, explained in more colorful terms exactly what the American commander meant. The Germans withdrew, and both sides prepared for the final phase of the siege. That night, German artillery began the heaviest bombardment of the siege, pounding Bastogne with everything from mortar to railroad guns.
Ow.
The paratroopers huddled. In their foxholes and basements, knowing that their defiance meant there would be no mercy when the final German assault came. But they had chosen their course, and they would see it through to the end. While the 101st Airborne Division fought for survival in the frozen streets of Bastogne, one of America's most controversial generals was planning the most audacious military maneuver of his career. General George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army, had been following the German offensive from his headquarters in Nancy, France, and he immediately recognized both the danger and the opportunity it presented. On December 19, 1944, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun to address the German breakthrough. The meeting included the top Allied commanders, General Omar Bradley, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and Patton himself. The atmosphere was tense. This was the first major German success on the Western Front since the Normandy landings, and it threatened to undo months of Allied progress. Eisenhower's opening words set the tone. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Despite his confident words, the Supreme Commander faced a strategic nightmare. German forces had created a bulge nearly 70 miles wide in his lines, and American units were retreating. Across a broad front, Montgomery, ever cautious, advocated for a defensive strategy that would allow the Germans to exhaust themselves against prepared positions. Bradley argued for local counterattacks to pinch off the German salient. But it was Patton who provided the most dramatic proposal. He would disengage 3 divisions from his current offensive in the Saar region and attack north into the German flank within 72 hours. The room fell silent. What Patton was proposing was militarily unprecedented. A 90-degree change of direction for an entire army in the middle of winter, executed with virtually no preparation time. Most military experts would have considered such a maneuver impossible under ideal conditions, let alone during a crisis. "When can you start?" Eisenhower asked. "I've already made arrangements," Patton replied. "I can attack on December 22nd with 3 divisions. By December 23rd, I can have 6 divisions on the move." Unknown to the other commanders, Patton had anticipated this moment. As soon as reports of the German offensive reached his headquarters, he had quietly ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this scenario. While other Allied leaders were still trying to understand the scope of the German threat, Patton was already moving his pieces into position. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, would lead Patton's thrust toward Bastogne. These veteran tankers had fought across France and into Germany with Patton's Third Army, earning a reputation as one of the most effective armored units in the European theater. They would need every bit of their experience for the mission ahead. On December 22nd, as McAuliffe was delivering his famous nuts reply to German surrender demands, Patton's forces began their historic dash to the north. The weather was against them. Snow and ice made the roads treacherous. In the same overcast skies that protected German forces from Allied air attack now hampered Patton's advance. According to this context taken from Martin Blumensen's The Patton Papers, the general drove his men with characteristic ruthlessness, appearing at division command posts to personally ensure that his orders were being executed with maximum speed and aggression. Units that reported delays due to weather or logistics were told to find solutions or be relieved. There was no time for excuses. The paratroopers in Bastogne were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and time. The race against time intensified on December 23rd when the weather briefly cleared, allowing the first Allied airdrops into Bastogne since the siege began. C-47 transport aircraft braved intense German anti-aircraft fire to deliver desperately needed supplies to the surrounded garrison. Many aircraft were shot down, but enough packages reached the paratroopers to give them hope that relief was coming. Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, spearheaded Patton's drive toward the Bastogne. Abrams, whose name would later grace America's main battle tank, was a tank commander of exceptional skill and aggression. His Shermans and tank destroyers ground forward through snow-clogged roads, fighting German rearguards and battling mechanical breakdowns caused by the extreme cold. The German forces defending the approaches to Bastogne were formidable. Elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the 5th Parachute Division had established strong defensive positions in the hills south of the town. These were not the demoralized conscripts that Allied intelligence had reported. They were veteran soldiers fighting for their homeland and their lives. By December 25th, Christmas Day, Abrams's tanks were within 5 miles of Bastogne. Behind them, the entire Third Army was wheeling north in one of the most remarkable military movements in history. Patton had indeed accomplished the impossible. He had changed the direction of an entire army in the middle of winter and launched a counteroffensive that threatened to cut off the entire German salient. But the Germans were not finished. Hitler had committed his last reserves to the Ardennes offensive, and they would fight with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the end of everything they had fought for. The race to Bastogne would be decided in the next 48 hours. December 26, 1944, dawned clear and cold across the Ardennes battlefield. For the first time since the German offensive began, Allied aircraft could take to the skies in strength and the sight of American and British fighters and bombers filled the air like avenging angels. The weather that had protected German forces during their initial breakthrough had finally turned against them. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams pushed his tanks forward at first light, knowing that every hour of delay meant more American casualties. In besieged Bastogne, Combat Command B had fought to within 3 miles of the town, but the final approach would be the most dangerous. German anti-tank guns were positioned in every likely avenue of approach, and the roads were mined and blocked with felled trees. At 4:45 in the afternoon, lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion finally broke through the German lines surrounding Bastogne. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead Sherman tank, established radio contact with the 101st Airborne Division. "Come on out, this is the 4th Armored." The siege of Bastogne was broken. Inside the town, the paratroopers, who had held out for 6 days against overwhelming odds, finally allowed themselves to believe they would survive. Medical supplies and ammunition flowed in as German prisoners were marched out. The relief was emotional as well as tactical. These men had faced annihilation and prevailed through sheer determination and superior leadership. But the breaking of the siege did not end the Battle of the Bulge. German forces still held a salient 50 miles deep and 60 miles wide, and Hitler was pouring in his last reserves to achieve some kind of victory from his winter gamble. The fighting would continue for another 3 weeks before the Bulge was finally eliminated. SS Obersturmbahn 4 Joachim Peiper's Kampftruppe, which had advanced farther than any other German unit during the offensive, found itself trapped near the Belgian town of L'Église. Allied forces had closed in around Peiper's column, cutting off his supply lines and escape routes. The same rapid advance that had made him the spearhead of the German offensive now made him the most exposed target for American revenge. Peiper's situation became desperate on December 24th, when American artillery began systematically destroying his vehicles. Fuel ran out, ammunition dwindled, and wounded men could not be evacuated. The massacre at Malmedy had marked Peiper and his men for special attention from American forces, who showed little inclination to take SS prisoners. According to this context taken from Danny Parker's comprehensive study Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's Ardennes offensive, Peiper made the decision to abandon his heavy equipment and attempt to escape on foot through the forest. On the night of December 23rd, he led 800 surviving members of his Kampftruppe in a desperate march toward German lines, leaving behind all their tanks, assault guns, and vehicles. The escape succeeded, but at enormous cost. Of the 4,000 men who had begun the offensive with Peiper's column, fewer than 800 made it back to German lines. The most successful German penetration of the offensive had been neutralized, and with it went Hitler's last hope of reaching the Meuse River. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had assumed command of all Allied forces north of the German salient, began his own counteroffensive on January 3, 1945. British and American forces attacked from the north, while Patton continued his drive from the south, gradually compressing the German Bulge and threatening to trap the remaining German forces in Belgium. The weather continued to favor the Allies, as clear skies allowed round-the-clock air attacks on German supply lines and troop concentrations. The Luftwaffe, which had surprised Allied forces with a massive New Year's Day attack on Allied airfields, could not sustain such operations and was quickly driven from the skies by superior Allied numbers and pilot training. German casualties mounted rapidly as their units were compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket. Fuel shortages forced the abandonment of hundreds of vehicles, including the massive King Tiger tanks that had struck such fear into American forces during the opening days of the offensive. Ammunition ran short, medical supplies were exhausted, and German soldiers began surrendering in increasing numbers. Hitler's response to the deteriorating situation was characteristically uncompromising. He ordered his forces to fight to the last man and forbade any retreat without his personal authorization. But military reality had moved beyond the Führer's fantasy. His generals began conducting unauthorized withdrawals to save what remained of their forces, knowing that the court-martial that awaited them was preferable to the annihilation that awaited their men. By January 8, 1945, the German salient had been reduced to a narrow corridor barely 20 miles wide. American and British forces were closing in from 3 directions, and German resistance was beginning to collapse. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase, but the cost of Hitler's last gamble was becoming apparent to both sides. The butcher's bill would be enormous, but the strategic implications were even more significant. Germany had committed its last reserves to the Ardennes offensive and lost them. The road to Berlin now lay open to the advancing Allied armies. January 28, 1945 marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge as American forces from the 1st and 3rd Armies linked up near Houffalize, Belgium, eliminating the last vestiges of the German salient. The Bulge that had threatened to split the Allied armies and change the course of the war had been reduced to a memory, marked by thousands of crosses in military cemeteries across the Ardennes. The statistical summary of the battle read like a catalogue of devastation. American casualties totaled over 9,000 men, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. It was the costliest battle fought by U.S. forces in the European theater, exceeding even the DAT landings in its toll of American lives. German losses were even more catastrophic, though precise figures remain disputed. Conservative estimates placed German casualties at over 100,000 men, including nearly 800 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. More significantly, Hitler's last mobile reserve had been shattered against the rocks of American determination and Allied material superiority. Private James McKenna, who had witnessed the opening moments of the German offensive from his farmhouse window 6 weeks earlier, found himself among the American forces advancing through the same villages that German panzers had captured in December. The landscape was a moonscape of destruction. Burned-out vehicles, collapsed buildings, and snow-covered graves marked the path of armies that had clashed in temperatures that reached 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The human cost extended far beyond military casualties. Belgian civilians had endured weeks of occupation, bombardment, and the desperate fighting that attended every change of hands. Villages like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and La Glaise were little more than rubble, their populations scattered or killed in the crossfire between armies. The liberation that came in January was welcome, but came too late for those who had paid the ultimate price for the German army. The Battle of the Bulge represented the end of offensive capability on the Western Front. The units that had participated in Hitler's winter gamble were shells of their former strength, their ranks filled with teenagers and middle-aged men who had been conscripted as the Wehrmacht scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel. The veteran NCOs and junior officers who had been the backbone of German tactical superiority were largely gone. Casualties of 6 years of global warfare, the strategic implications became apparent within weeks of the battle's conclusion. With his Western Front stabilized, Eisenhower was free to plan the final assault on Germany itself. The delays caused by the Ardennes offensive had cost the Allies 6 weeks. But those same weeks had cost Germany its last hope of avoiding total defeat. according to this context taken from the official U.S. Army Center of Military History Analysis, the Ardennes Offensive. Hitler's decision to launch the winter offensive may have actually hastened Germany's collapse by destroying forces that might have been used more effectively in defensive operations along the Rhine River or in eastern Prussia against the advancing Soviet armies. The battle's impact on Allied strategy was equally significant. The shock of the German breakthrough had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, despite its apparent weakness, remained a dangerous opponent capable of tactical surprise and local superiority. This lesson influenced Allied planning for the final campaigns of the war, leading to more cautious advances and stronger defensive preparations for individual participants. The Battle of the Bulge became a defining experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Veterans spoke of the bitter cold that froze weapons and made simple tasks like eating or loading ammunition nearly impossible. They remembered comrades who froze to death in foxholes and the desperate expedients required to survive in conditions that seemed designed to kill even before enemy action was considered. The massacre at Malmedy cast a long shadow over the battle's aftermath. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper and several of his subordinates were eventually tried and convicted of war crimes. Though Peiper's death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, the memory of murdered American prisoners served as a rallying cry for Allied forces throughout the remainder of the war and influenced the harsh treatment of SS units during the final campaigns in Germany. General George Patton's relief of Bastogne became one of the most celebrated military achievements in American history, demonstrating that rapid maneuver and aggressive leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Third Army's 90-degree change of direction in the middle of winter remained a textbook example of military flexibility and commander's intuition. As spring returned to the Ardennes in 1945, farmers began the grim task of clearing their fields of the detritus of battle. Tank hulks were hauled away for scrap, unexploded ordnance was carefully removed by engineer units, and life slowly returned to villages that had seen some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its lessons would endure. In the frozen forests of Belgium, American soldiers had proved that citizen soldiers could match the professional warriors of Germany. When fighting for principles they believed in, the Coldest battle had become America's finest hour, purchased with blood in the snow of the Ardennes.